You're watching Startup Central with me, Nantara Rai. This is the first episode since Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the Union budget. In that, the Finance Minister has attempted to formalize the gig economy. She has spoken about a portal that is going to actually recognize and register gig workers, but she's also spoken about how social security benefits, including PF, that's Provident Fund, will be extended to gig workers. How is this going to impact the gig economy? What does it mean for the gig workers, and what does it mean those that engage with gig workers? We thought we'll reach out to a startup, a unicorn actually, that engages with over 1 lakh gig workers. It is Swiggy, and joining me live right here on Startup Central is the Chief Operating Officer at Swiggy, Vivek Sundar. Vivek, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us here on Startup Central. You've seen the Narendra Modi government now try to formalize the gig economy. There are two ways of looking at it. Yes, there may be a political messaging behind it. This is a government that has very often talked about when you complain about no job creation, you don't look at the gig workforce, you don't look at what an Ola or a Swiggy or a Zomato, etc. are doing. So it's trying to formalize that. But on the other hand, as it tries to formalize it, it means more compliance from the startup as well as, of course, from the gig workers. Have I got that right?
Good evening, Nantha. Always a pleasure to be with you. So let me start with parts of the speech from the Honorable Finance Minister that you actually did show. You talked about the fact that it'll be easier for women to work in the gig economy workforce. And I want to sort of start with that and then get to the mainstream of how is it going to affect the industry. We today have only about 1,000 women delivery partners in over 18 cities. I'm hoping that formalizing, getting more safety in, getting it better for the gig economy worker and making it a little more reasonable for them to work in will attract more and more of these women, because there is no reason why when over lakhs and lakhs of delivery partners are there, it should be so skewed. After all, they do a brilliant job actually of the delivery itself. So I did notice that fact that she made, and I thought that's very interesting. It should help us if that also means we have it in 500 cities as opposed to the 18 cities that we have right now. But on a more uber note, we've been supportive of the fact that gig economy workers need to be in a way in which they find it easy to come to work, easy to be able to get the benefits that are due to them. And after all, the nature of the work is such that they do work when they feel like working. There are lots of advantages of the gig worker system. So given that the new economy has come up with a sort of work on demand or work on tap, and the gig economy is a sort of slang for that, we think that it's a great thing overall for the ecosystem to actually have a little more formal processes around it. We're hoping that the regulatory burden in terms of the paperwork will not be onerous. After all, it is a product of the new world. So hopefully the compliance burden in terms of the paperwork, etc., will be simple. The details are yet awaited. But overall, we would be supportive as an ecosystem player and one of the major ecosystem players that something that is so crucial to the actual delivery of the service to lakhs of consumers is actually going to be more supported and more formalized in a way that makes it easy for the workers themselves.
So let's talk about all of that a little more in detail. Now, we've also seen a lot of startups or unicorns like yours being responsible, already extending benefits to your delivery partners, to the gig workers that you engage with. But not everybody does it, and everybody should be doing it, right? That's the clear intent and statement also by the Finance Minister. That's obviously going to put pressure on unit economics.
It's the right thing for the business. I mean, it's as simple as that. We are not doing accident and medical insurance for the lakhs of delivery partners we have. We are not doing, skill development and on-call doctors and the, protection during COVID because it is, unit economics high or low. It's the right thing to do. A worker who's happy to come to work is eventually going to do better customer experience. We had lakhs of workers in stress during the worst of the COVID lockdown, not wanting to come to work. But the moment they realize that we are having sort of protections in place, both in terms of temperature checks and masks and everything else, and also protection in terms of medical cover and help in case they actually had COVID, is what prompted them to come to work and basically earn a living when it was really tough during those times. So I think it may put pressure on unit economics for some players, but as far as we are concerned, because we've been already doing much of it, it's a great thing. We will encourage it, and if everybody does it, then it just lifts all boat. It's a good thing for the ecosystem and the industry.
From the union budget speech, and and the fine print that has come out since then, Vivek Sundar, you're one of the best to get this from. What do startups and those that engage with gig workers now need to do?
I guess we are awaiting the details in terms of how it'll actually work in terms of the mechanics, the portals, the contributions, and what all is covered and all of that. We are still awaiting the details. But the moment we get those details, we will quickly convert what we are effectively doing in situ as a de facto social cover that we are providing and make it a little more formal to everybody that's part of it. And so we are just waiting to see what the details are before we sort of convert our own sort of homegrown system into the formal system that the government is proposing.
Workers enter the formal system and they get, and you see an extension of social security, and that'll include Provident Fund. I know it's a little technical in nature, but then wouldn't they become employees? And wouldn't that mean that a company like Swiggy or a Zomato or an Ola, or those that work with gig workers, will have to contribute, and then so will the gig worker, because that's how all of us understand it, right? In the old economy, that's how it works.
Again, I don't know the details of how much is the contribution. Like in a typical non-gig worker, there is a contribution law on what the employer does and what the employee does. We don't have the details yet. But as far as our contribution is concerned, we are already de facto contributing towards their security. And the moment there is a framework for us to formally contribute towards that, it's a good thing. Whether they're going to ask those gig workers to contribute or not, what is the sort of ratio, all of those details are awaited. But I think the devil will lie in the detail in terms of what is it for the gig worker. We think it will be reasonable because the government, I guess, realizes that this is not a worker who's essentially at spanning the full spectrum of entry-level worker all the way up to factory manager in that sense. So given that it is largely entry-level jobs and largely jobs which are on demand, I think they will not put too much of a burden on these gig workers. That's my belief, but I'm yet to see the details.
And now when you have a portal, what will that mean? Like, you don't have a portal for white-collar employees. So what would this be? Would this be a database where, people who need to engage with gig workers can go there? Is that your understanding? Or is this basically to tabulate and know that this is the kind of employment creation we have, and these are the gig workers, and this is what they're entitled to?
I guess from the intent of what I've understood from the finance minister's speech and some of the documents I've seen post that, it is to make sure that there is by definition, a social security is sort of a safety net that is there for the worker who is not formally employed, who is essentially coming into work on a gig basis. We will need to know what the definitions are and how many hours of work constitutes gig, and is it a single task or is it X hours a month? Those details we don't know yet, but surely there'll be reasonable definitions in terms of what is a gig worker. We think a lot of our workers will basically fall into that, which is great. And I think the portal will make sure that it is essentially a framework for making sure that everybody, the big companies and the small companies, are providing it, because at the end of the day, this shouldn't be a differentiator. Whether you're helping your worker deal with the problems that happen if there is a loss of job or a loss of pay or an accident or a medical insurance, these are not things that should be negotiable. These should be provided to every worker. So in that sense, we think it's a leveling of the playing field when it comes to large gig players as well as the entry-level gig players.
I want to go back to how we began this conversation, and that is, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's attempt to make sure that more women enter the gig workforce. You gave your own example, and I'm sure others also face this challenge. But the question, Vivek, is also that merely extending certain benefits, whether it is medical insurance, accidental cover, and we don't know, right, what the social security definition will be. Is that going to be enough to get women into the gig workforce?
I think it'll be a step, but not the complete set of things that need to be in place. Companies will need to make sure, I mean, it's the same whether it is gig economy workers or lady workers in factories or lady workers on the field in Salesforce or indeed in offices. There has to be a concerted effort made by companies towards making sure that they're able to work at times that are meaningful for them. A lot of our lady executives will talk about how much of a benefit it is for them when, let's say they've, either their husbands have left for work or their kids have gone for school, and they basically have, 6 hours between the time, and they're able to do a few deliveries and earn and supplement the family income. Some others, by the way, are essentially working as their sort of full-time workers. So I think depending on people who want to do a part-time job and therefore augment the family income or be the mainstay and do this as a main work, the fact that there is a formal system that recognizes it and provides them some kind of cover, and therefore there's no chance of an exploitation, etc., is the benefit that we think will be there, but that's a necessary, not sufficient condition. Companies will have to think a little bit about making sure that, for example, the late night slots, we don't, for example, insist that the ladies take the late night slots if they're not comfortable. We allow them the flexibility of choosing the slots that they take, and a lot of them end up taking the day slots, which is convenient for them and their families. So we think that if companies were to do their bit and the government is doing its bit, only then the needle will move. Otherwise, the 1 lakh out of, the sort of 10,000 out of 1 lakh number is not going to budge. So I think it'll require both of us to do it. Hopefully, this is an impetus to make us do it. Because I'm not saying it because it is the right thing to do from an ethical and sort of, fair practices point of view. I'm saying because it's also good for the business. So it's sort of it's a win-win. It's the right thing to do for the consumer. It's the right thing to do for the business, and it's the right thing to do for society.
Vivek, I'm not going to put my guests here on the show on the spot by asking them, were you disappointed? Because, you all were so hungry for a lot more in this union budget. But, the indication we've got is that there will be many, many more reforms. And this is just the start. And we've seen a lot of resilience from the startup universe, especially during the pandemic. It was actually the startups and the tech companies that rose to the occasion, right? That's how we made sure our kids went to classrooms. That's how we made sure that we got groceries. That's how we made sure we ate, we got medicines, all of that. So I'll leave that conversation for another time. But what I would like to ask you is that this is a budget which has given an impetus to growth. It's put growth first, and it's done so without making sure that the salaried class or the taxpayers have to pay anymore. It's status quo. Good news for consumption?
Look, we're in the consumer space. So anything that basically takes or unleashes the animal spirits, as has been spoken about in the last 48 hours a lot, and basically provides a fillip to consumption in total is something we would like. I think the good news is that people, rightly so, are still following precautions, but have basically not thinking about COVID as crazily as they were like 6 months ago. And therefore, consumption of, online food delivery, going out to restaurants has increased. I'm sure you see that even where you live. I think if therefore consumers who are not going to be as sick as they thought they would be and are essentially now also going to be vaccinated and therefore safer, are essentially going back to work and the economy all the wheels of the economy start turning, we cannot say as a consumer-facing company that it's a bad thing. It's a great thing for consumers to be going back to greasing the wheels of growth. And I think that in that sense, anything as a consumer company that allows growth to happen is a good thing, because there is a definite trickle effect that happens on industries like ours.
So as, restaurants and hotels have started reopening, right, in the last many months, but more and more people are now getting more comfortable dining out. How has that been for business?
So obviously what's happened is that there has been a gradual unlocking and therefore opening up of restaurants with social distancing norms and so on and so forth. I think that people have started going, many restaurants these days, you need to now book, because otherwise you won't get a seat. because of course seating capacity is lower and people are getting to work. So I think we are seeing revival. However, it is not fair for me to say that that industry hasn't faced the pain that it has. I mean, you've probably covered that in other articles about how the restaurant industry as a total has suffered so much through the worst of the pandemic. So they're still sort of, bearing those scars. There's been a fair bit of mortality in that industry in terms of restaurants shutting down. But I think the beautiful thing about that is that while we have these bad sort of sad news of restaurants shutting down, on the other hand, we have 5,000 to 6,000 restaurants every month wanting to open and come on to the platforms like ours, which is a great thing because it means that people are basically thinking about the industry as a whole, as a new thing. There is a sort of revival. Perhaps they're coming back with more of a ratio of delivery versus dine-in because of the nature of what they think is going to be the environment in the next 1 year. But entrepreneurs are coming back into the industry. So it's not one of those things where people are kind of avoiding it like the plague, but they're actually entering. And that's a good thing, despite the gloom that some members of the restaurant family have faced.
With that, Vivek, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to thank you. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for being so candid and for joining us here on this edition of Startup Central. It's our first edition since Union Budget. And for startups, we thought that one of the big things that came out was the formalization of gig economy, because it's going to have to require maybe tweaking of business models, how you all approach gig workers. You've, of course, like been saying, you've been doing it already. A lot more need to step up now.